Здравствуйте, вы смотрите канал
Hello,
форума
this is a
«Свободной
free
России». Меня зовут
Russia
Дмитрий
forum
Семенов.
channel.
Сегодня 30
I'm Dmitry
ноября,
Semyonov.
пятница,
Today is
предпоследний
the
день
30th of
уходящего года и
November,
последний в этом
one of the
году
last days
наш
of the
вечерний
passing year,
эфир на
and
канале
this is
форума
our
«Свободной России». Меня
last
зовут Дмитрий Семенов.
stream
Раз это последний в этом году
this
эфир,
year.
то
And since
понятно,
it's the
что мы будем
last stream
подводить в
of this
основном итоги
year, we
уходящего
will
года и,
be
может быть,
mostly
будем определять и
summarizing
прогнозировать
and
какие-то
maybe
события, которые могут
highlighting
произойти в
and
следующем году,
determining
ну или хотя бы
some
тренды
events that will be
какие-то. Конечно
happening
же, это мы
next
будем
year,
делать с политиком,
highlighting some
сооснователем форума
trends.
«Свободной
We'll do
России»,
it
13-й
together
чемпион мира
with the
по шахматам Гарри
politician,
Каспаровым. Гарри,
co-founder
привет,
of Free
тебя
Russia
слушаю.
Forum, and the 13th
Приветствую. Вообще-то
World
30
Chess
декабря все.
Champion.
А
Hello,
я
but
сказал
actually
ноября,
this is
да?
the 30th
Вот
of
видите, уже.
December. Did I say
Да.
November? Oh, I'm sorry.
Ну, ничего, надо.
That's okay.
Конец года, да, последняя неделя
It's the
года,
end
она
of the
такая
year, the
сложная,
last
столько
week of the year.
мероприятий и уже.
Да.
There are so
Ну
many
что ж,
events.
я сразу обращусь
So
к нашим зрителям.
I
Во-первых,
would like to
скажу, что у
ask
нас
our
есть чат с
audience
трансляцией, за которым я
to look at
периодически
the chat
поглядываю, и там мы ждем
for our
ваших
stream.
вопросов
So
тоже
we're
в том числе.
expecting questions
Ну и
from
кроме
you in that
того,
stream.
просим от вас лайков для того,
And
чтобы
please
нас в
like
ходе
our stream so that
этого
more people
эфирного
would see
часа стало
us.
еще больше. Гарри Кимович, ну вот, собственно,
Garry,
когда спрашиваешь людей, да, знакомых или
when we
смотришь
ask
какие-то
people
видео
around
уличных опросов,
and when we watch
ну и вообще
polls
какие-то
in the
социологические
streets
опросы, может быть, то
or
на
get
вопрос,
information of
чем
some
вам больше всего
sociological
запомнился этот
surveys,
год, понятно,
and we
что
ask
ну,
the question,
подавляющая часть, почти
what you
все
remember
говорят,
the
что
most
это
from this
война.
year? And
И
the
вот,
overwhelming majority is saying that
соответственно,
this is the
поскольку у нас
war.
война за окном,
And
война
since
такая
it is
кровавая,
war,
страшная, ну, за окном
it's pretty
не в
bloody
прямом
war,
смысле, да, то этот год, наверное, тяжело
then
назвать с каким-то знаком плюс, он скорее
this
для
year
многих со
couldn't be
знаком
called a
минус.
positive
Но
year.
эта
It's more like a
война в том
negative year.
числе послужила таким триггером
And
для
this
многих
war
событий, которые
triggered
происходили в этом
many
году.
events that
Я бы
were
хотел,
happening
чтобы
this
вы,
year.
наверное, для начала назвали
I would like to
какие-то
ask you
самые
to
важные
name
события
maybe the
наряду с
most
войной,
important
которые
events
будут
alongside
определять
with the war that
ход
will
развития в
determine
следующем году.
the developments next year.
Ну, как уже было сказано, война все перебивает.
As you said, the war
События, которые делают
overshadows
22 год
everything.
исключительным.
This event makes
Я не знаю, можно назвать
2022
какие-то
an exceptional
события в
year.
этом году и даже, может быть, в
I can't
предыдущие
even
годы, которые
tell what
могли
other
бы
events or events of
хотя
the
бы
previous years
приблизительно как бы
could
соответствовать вот
be
этому
compared
уровню
with the level of great
высочайшей исторической
historical
ответственности.
importance of this event.
24 февраля 2022 года – это дата, ну,
24th of February of
она соизмерима с
2022,
22 июня
this date can be
41
compared
года,
to
с 1 сентября
June
1939
22nd of
года,
1941,
с, ну, там я
1st
уже не знаю,
September
там,
1st of
1 августа 14
1939,
года можно
maybe
говорить,
August
там, или
1st of
28
1914,
июня
or
14 года, когда был убит
28th of
Архиепископ
June
Сараева.
of
Ну, совершенно очевидно, что
1914 when
24 февраля
Archduke was
22 года
killed in
стоит в этом
Sarajevo.
историческом ряду.
So this
А этот
date,
исторический ряд
24th of
имеет, ну,
February,
там,
is in this
ну,
historical
так широкие
line.
руки, как уже
And I
хватило, там,
think
ну, понятно, что мы говорим про очень
it's a
ограниченный
rare
круг
event.
событий,
And here we're
которые
talking
так
about
влияли на
a
мировую
limited
историю,
number
причем не
of
только на
events that
то, что
impacted
происходит вот сейчас,
global
а
history
события, которые будут
and
происходить, они
impacted
все
not
равно
only
будут
what's happening
иметь
now,
вот
but
исходную
even the
точку
events that will be happening in the
на
future.
24
And those
февраля
future events, they will have their initial
Другое дело,
point
что если
in
посмотреть
24th
как
of
бы
February.
на события прошлого,
If we
которые я
look
упомянул, то
at the past events,
вот 24 февраля вот уходящего года
24th of February of
наверное, отличается тем,
2022
что все к этому шло. Вот
is
здесь
different
очень
because
кардинально
everything was
интересно
leading
опять
to this.
исторически
And
правильно
again,
сказать.
quite
Поэтому
interesting
я
historical
уклонюсь
parallels.
от
That's
прямого
why
на вопрос,
let me a little
какие
bit
события еще в
deviate
этом
from
году.
the direct answer to
Все
this question.
события
What are the
22
events?
года
Actually,
так или
all
иначе
events of
связаны
2022,
с
in one way or another, they are
российской
linked
агрессией против
to
нас.
the Russian aggression in
Но
Ukraine.
надо немножко отойти назад и зафиксировать важнейший факт, что
But we need to back
эта
up
же
a
агрессия
little
произошла не на
and
ровном
say
месте.
that this
Это про
aggression
начало Первой
wasn't
мировой
out
войны
of the
можно
blue.
говорить, что да, действительно было много
Yes, for World War I, we can say there were many incidents, and probably they could make an agreement back then, but actually everything was leading to this. There were numerous crises, and back then they were kind of avoiding them. But according to statistics, everything was leading to sort of explosion, and leading European countries
к тому моменту,
They
когда,
were
ну, война и
supposed to
война уже,
get to a
никто не
certain point
понимал
when there will
последствий.
be a war, and nobody actually understood what the consequences
Вторая
of that
мировая
war
война была в
would
этом
be.
плане более
World War
предсказуема,
II
вот,
was more predictable.
но все равно мне кажется, что вот если мы будем говорить про события, в которых мы непосредственно участвовали,
But nevertheless, if we're talking about the events that
удивительным
we are
образом
participating in,
достаточно как бы очевидная
surprisingly,
подготовка путинского режима
it
к
was
этой
quite
войне,
obvious that Putin regime
она
was preparing for
игнорировалась.
this war,
Игнорировалась
and
как в
it was
России, так
ignored
и за
both in
рубежом.
Russia and
И, наверное,
abroad.
вот события вот 22 года,
And
если
the events of
как бы их рассматривать
2022,
через призму
if we look at them through the
этой страшной
lens
войны,
of this horrible
они
war,
так или иначе
these
связаны
events
с
are linked
попытками
to attempts
разных политических
of
сил,
different political forces,
как
both
западных, так и
in the
вообще по
West,
всему миру,
across the
ну и,
world,
естественно,
and
конечно,
naturally in Russia,
многих людей в России, себя
to
позиционировать
present
на
themselves
фоне события, которое,
as
как
if
я
the
уже говорил,
war
было, на мой взгляд, на взгляд
came
многих,
out of
мне
the
кажется,
blue.
достаточно
For me and
очевидным,
my
потому что все к
colleagues,
этому
the
шло,
possibility of the
но
war
все
was
равно
quite
как
obvious.
бы как гром среди ясного
But for
неба.
them, it was like
Все
thunder
для
in the clear sky.
многих случилось. И вот мы видим в 22 году, как кардинально меняются
We
все
see how in
расстановки.
2022
Если
all
начинать с России, то
arrangements are
понятно, что это
radically
исход.
changed.
Это исход из сознательных людей,
And
которые
if we look at Russia,
уже
this
не
is
видели у себя
exodus
возможности продолжать
of many people
функционировать в
from
России.
Russia
Хотя
and people
за
who
многие
can't
годы
see
до этого,
themselves in Russia
несмотря
anymore
на
and how they're going to
откровенную
operate in
фашизацию
Russia
режима, они
anymore.
считали, что
Though,
Россия все равно
despite
сгибет
everything they saw in Russia and they saw the
большой пласт
gradual fascistization in Russia,
сегодняшней российской оппозиции,
yet there is quite
российской
a layer of
эмиграции,
Russian
так сказать,
opposition, or rather Russian
который
immigration.
много лет говорил «чур меня» и хотел, в общем,
For
видеть
many
все
years they were saying,
очевидным.
touch me not.
Это и
They didn't
позиция
want to
Запада,
see the
который
obvious.
многие
On the other
годы
hand,
не верил
there
в
is
то,
this
что
position
Путин
of the
пересмотрит все
West,
красные линии, хотя он
the people
переходил их
who
последовательно.
didn't believe that Putin will be
И
crossing all
поэтому
these red
на
lines,
Западе
yet he was
произошли,
actually
на мой
consistently
взгляд,
doing this.
необратимые изменения не только в отношении России
And due to
конкретно,
this, in the
но и, в
West, there were
общем-то,
significant
в
changes,
видении мира. Вот
not
достаточно
only
сказать,
towards
что
Russia, but
Швеция
even
и
towards
Финляндия, особенно Швеция,
the
которая
vision of the
действительно была
world.
нейтральной, вступают в
Sweden
НАТО.
and Finland,
Потому что
they
понимать, что
joined in NATO,
происходят
and
события,
Sweden was
которые
neutral for 200 years.
еще несколько лет назад казались невозможными.
Now
Вот
we
это
see
вот,
the events
вот
that were
начало
absolutely impossible several years
полномасштабного
ago.
вторжения, вот этот
Since the beginning of this
военный конфликт,
full-scale
ну достаточно
invasion,
вяло текущий, хотя, конечно, там украинцы могут
things changed
критиковать, но тем не менее
significantly.
по мировым меркам он был
The
вяло
conflict that
текущий,
started in Ukraine
перерастающий
was
в
latent for
войну,
many years, and
которая
now
может
it
быть
is growing
сопоставима по
into a
своей интенсивности
war,
только со
and it
Второй мировой
can be
войной,
compared only with
а на
World War
некоторых,
II.
как говорится, вот, участках боевых действий она по интенсивности даже
And in
превосходит,
some front lines of the
совершенно
war,
очевидно,
this war is even
что,
more intensive than World War II.
конечно, мир стал другим.
The
В
world
том числе,
is
кстати, это
different
касается и
now.
стран, которые далеки от конфликта. Если посмотреть там
And if we
на
look
Африку, ну,
broader,
естественно,
then we
Китай,
see that there are
Индию. То
countries that
есть
are far from this
вот
conflict, like
в
Africa,
мире, в котором все связано, то,
China.
что происходит сегодня в Украине, влияет на все просто.
Somehow everything that's
Поэтому,
happening
вот,
in
как бы,
Ukraine
уже подводя итог
impacts
этого
everything in the
длинного,
world.
немножечко сумбурного ответа на
So
прозвучавший
now,
вопрос,
wrapping up
я
my
скажу, что
kind of
вот все эти
erratic
события
answer to your
сегодня, они
question,
привязаны к
I'd
Украине.
say that
Любые сегодня действия.
any event that's
Даже если
happening
мы
in the
посмотрим
world
там
is somehow linked to
съезд
Ukraine.
китайской компартии,
If even we
безусловно,
look
важное
at
событие,
the
хотя тоже
Congress of the
предсказуемое.
Communist Party
Си
in
Цзиньпин
China,
стал
which is actually
как бы
important
уже
event, and Xi Jinping
окончательно трансформируется в
finally
диктатора.
transformed
Все полномочия. Вот
into a
это
dictator.
коллективное руководство,
He has
которое в
all the
Китае
authorities now.
действует
This
со времен Дэн
collective
Сяопина,
body
как бы
that
наследие
worked since the times
китайских
of
реформ,
Deng
оно
Xiaoping
уступило место
in Chinese
уже
reforms,
откровенной диктатуре.
now
И
it's been
тем не менее,
replaced
мы все
with a
понимаем,
dictatorship.
что за всей, как говорится, риторикой китайских коммунистов, разговоров
And
о
we understand
Тайване,
that behind all this rhetoric of
вообще
Chinese
своих там,
communists,
как говорится,
Taiwan,
китайских
and
проблемах, все равно вот
unity
Украина
of
молчаливо
China,
присутствовала. И мы
somehow in
понимаем,
all
что
these talks
это
we
является
have the
главной
silent
потребностью. Как себя
presence
вести
of
с Россией?
Ukraine.
Как можно помогать
Ukraine
Путину
is
так, чтобы и под санкции не попасть, ну
the
и так, чтобы
catalyst.
все-таки как-то сохранить
And now they're
какое-то
looking and
влияние.
thinking
И
how
очевидно,
to
что все
do
китайские
things
планы китайских
and not to get under
коммунистов
sanctions.
атаковать Тайвань, они подвергаются
And
сегодня
now all
ревизии,
plans of
потому
China
что
to
все
attack
смотрят
Taiwan,
на то,
they're
что
all
происходит
revised
в Украине.
because they're
Ну и
looking at what's
повторяю,
happening
так
in
можно
Ukraine.
пройти по всему миру. Сегодня
And you can look at
любые
any
движения,
situation
они
in the
имеют
world
как бы
the same way.
как минимум как фигуру умолчания Украину,
Because
которая
any
влияет
move
на все.
in the world
Там Солнце влияет на движение
is
планеты.
kind of
Это большая
affected
звезда,
by what's
которая
happening in
влияет
Ukraine,
сегодня
like the
своей
sun
гравитацией
impacts
политической
all the planets.
Ну да, ну и не зря, соответственно, многими признается, многими мировыми изданиями,
And
в том
actually,
числе и
many
Украины, и Владимира Зеленского
global
22 года,
publications
и человеком этого
named
2022 года.
Ukraine
Гарри
the
Климович,
country of the
раз уж
year,
вы
and they named
сами
Zelensky the man of the
заговорили
year.
о
This is how
событиях
they recognize
прошлого,
it.
в историю
Since
окунулись,
you're talking
то
about the
мы не
past and the
можем,
history,
конечно, не
Gary,
вспомнить сегодня об
we of
еще
course
одном событии, об
should
еще одной
remember
дате, круглой дате,
another
30
important date.
декабря у нас сегодня, это
This is
ровно
the
100 лет
30th
с момента
of December.
образования
It's exactly 100
Советского
years since the
Союза.
foundation of the
И вот
Soviet
у
Union.
меня в связи с этим вопрос к вам.
And I have a
Многие вот
question.
любят приписывать Путину любовь к красивым числам. А как вам
People
кажется,
say that
когда он
Putin
начинал
likes
24 февраля,
these
он вот
nice
эту вот дату, 30
figures.
декабря
When he
2022 года
started the
держал
war
в
in
уме? Ну, то есть
24th of
понятно,
February,
что
did he
Киев за
keep
3
in
дня это
mind
скорее такая,
this date of
такая
foundation of the
гипербола, да,
Soviet
но
Union,
может
this
быть он
30th of December? Maybe
рассчитывал
it's
Киев там за 2-3 месяца, а дальше Молдова, а дальше еще
kind of
что-то.
symbol.
И 30
Maybe he
декабря
planned
22 года в
Kiev
его
not
голове,
for
может быть,
2-3
выстраивалась
days. He
такая
was thinking
картинка
about a couple of
восстановления
months, and
Советской
then
империи.
Moldova, and then he would be restoring the Soviet Union by the 30th of December. Oh no, Dmitry, let's not create new mythology. Of course, his plan was to take over Kiev for 2-3 days, maybe 4 days, no months. All actions of the Russian army were directed to this. And you can find a lot of evidence in official sources and unofficial sources, and everybody who was participating in the war from the Ukrainian side, they can tell that everything was dedicated to take over Kiev for a couple of days. And one of the indirect confirmations of this was the decision of Medvedchuk, the pro-Putin Ukrainian politician, to stay in Ukraine, waiting for Russian troops. And he understood all the risks, and he could only make this decision if he was absolutely sure that the invasion will be successful. And obviously Kiev today, when you analyze the attack on Kiev, and you can get all information, and you can see that Kiev was the main target of this attack. And the situation back then was quite critical. Attack on Kiev was concentrated and very powerful. And on the third day of the war, the Russian troops were on the outskirts of Kiev. And only failure of the Russian army and heroism of the Ukrainian army that managed to defend one of the most important airfields that the Russian command was planning to use as a logistical hub. They needed this site to land their aircraft with paratroopers, and only heroic defense of Ukrainian army stopped the Russians. And the decision of Zelensky's decision to stay in Kiev, and I'm sure that he understood all the risks and the risks for his family. And I think it turned out to be quite an important psychological factor that helped Ukrainians to heroically defend Kiev. And answering your question, 30th of December of 2022, he probably had it in his head, but it had to do with other plans of his. He planned to conquer Ukraine very quickly. Moldova, quite possible. Maybe he had a global plan, and clearly after taking over Kiev, he could be dealing with Moldova. But I don't think it was the main goal. If he was victorious, clearly he would be absolutely audacious, and he would give the West a serious ultimatum. Cut Ukraine, stop Ukrainian statehood, stop it from being an independent country and making it a satellite of Russia. And I think he would seriously think about the political state of the Baltic countries. He would simply made an ultimatum to the West, and given how coward and inconsistent Western politicians are, and actually they're quite consistent in pacifying Putin, I don't know how the circumstances unfold. And his victory in Ukraine would give him a great trump card in this political bargaining. And the Baltic countries wouldn't feel easy in this situation. Of course, there is this Article 5 of NATO Security Treaty,
но что-то у меня большие сомнения
But I really have
в готовности
quite
НАТО
significant
на
doubts
тот
that
момент
NATO
противостоять
would be
путинской
ready
агрессии,
to
если бы
resist
она
Putin's
выплеснулась
aggression
уже
if this aggression
за пределы Украины
went
и
beyond
коснулась бы
the
уже
Ukrainian
стран
borders.
НАТО. То есть, скорее всего, у Путина такие планы были. Вот. Мне кажется, что он
Most
как
probably Putin
оппортунист такой,
had these
диктаторский,
plans. I think
исходил
he's
из
a
того, что он сказал,
dictator
там,
and
Киев взять, там,
opportunist.
решить эти
First, he would
проблемы.
take over
Но,
Kiev,
может
dealt
быть,
with those issues,
30 декабря
then
было такой вот как бы реперной
would go
точкой
further. And the 30th
к
of
моменту
December
наступления этой даты. Путин вполне возможно
was
планировал в
a
какой-то мере
landmark, and
не
maybe by
реинкарнацию
this
СССР,
date
но во
he
всяком
was
случае
planning maybe,
воссоздание
if not reincarnation of the USSR, then probably
Российской империи,
a
Советского
rebuilding
Союза, неважно, как это
of the
называется, такое
Russian
образование.
Empire, Soviet
Как
Union,
бы
or
если
whatever
не
you
в
call
ее
this
там как
formation.
бы
If
первозданном
not
виде
in its
на момент
initial
1917 года,
borders
то уж по
as of
крайней мере
1917,
это была бы
but at
политическая
least
формация, оказывающая решающее влияние на события в Европе.
it would be a
Да,
political
но пока
formation that
приходится
would
довольствоваться
affect
так
main
называемым
events in Europe.
братством кольца, да, да и то кольцо только
Well,
Лукашенко
so far we
соглашался
can
надевать,
call the
подаренное
evil fellowship of the
неформальном
ring,
саммите СНГ
and
лидерам
only
соответственно стран,
Lukashenko is
которые
wearing
приехали к нему в Россию.
the ring
Ну, получается так,
that
что
he was given by
обломал зубы
Putin.
Путин
So it seems like
об
Putin
Украину, да.
broke his
И
teeth
можно ли
over
сказать, или это
Ukraine.
будет
Can we
преувеличением, пока
say
я скажу,
that,
что
or it's a bit
Украина своей смелостью,
an
своим героизмом
exaggeration that Ukraine, with
предотвратила
its
Третью мировую войну. Как
courage
раз
and
сегодня бывший президент
heroism,
Польши Квасневский говорил о том,
prevented
что мир стоит на
World
пороге
War
Третьей
III?
мировой.
Because ex-president of Poland Kwasniewski was saying that
Пока у
we are
власти в
just
России
at the
Путин,
edge of World War III.
мне кажется, что
See, Dmitry,
сохраняются все
while
риски.
Putin is in
Другое дело,
power,
что я
we still
всегда
facing
оценивал
these
как
risks of World War III.
достаточно незначительные.
Yet I'd say that
Развязывание ядерной
this
войны, когда
probability is quite
пока выходит
insignificant
за
because
рамки
waging
нормального
a
политического
nuclear
прогноза,
war
все
is
это
kind of beyond a normal political forecast,
крайне маловероятно. Тем не менее,
and
все эти
it's
риски
hardly
сохраняются.
possible.
Но также
Yet
совершенно
all these
очевидно,
risks remain,
что
and it's also quite obvious
героическое сопротивление Украины
that the heroic
и
resistance of Ukrainians
политическое лидерство Владимира
and the
Зеленского
political
создали
leadership
иную
of Vladimir
ситуацию не только в
Zelensky
Европе, но и в мире.
created a
В
completely
принципе,
different
надо
situation in
просто признать.
Europe and in the
Украина,
world. We just need to
я хочу сказать, выполнила, но
recognize
выполняет
that
сегодня
Ukraine
блистательно
is
ровно ту задачу, которая была поставлена перед НАТО
accomplishing the
в
mission
1949 году.
that NATO was made
Спасти
for
свободную
in
Европу от советского вторжения.
1949 to save free
Да,
Europe
границы Европы,
from the
свободной
Soviet
Европы
Union
сдвинулись.
invasions.
Когда
Of
они
course, the
проходили,
borders of free
освободили
Europe kind of
Германию,
moved.
вот,
Back then, the Allies, they divided Germany.
Сегодня эти границы
Today,
сдвинулись уже далеко на восток.
this border is moved
Вот пока мы говорим,
far
то
to the
есть,
east.
можно уже смело сказать,
And
что
while we're
сейчас,
talking,
на
we
данный
can
момент вот нашего
surely
разговора,
say
эти границы проходят по
that
Днепру.
this border
Вот просто вот
is going
вот
along the
Днепр — это та
Dnieper
самая
River.
граница
The
сегодня
Dnieper
свободной
River,
Европы
this is
и
the border
тирании
between the free
российской,
Europe
советской, имперской.
and
Вот опять, это тут уже каждый прилагательное
tyranny.
по
Russian
вкусу делает.
tyranny, Soviet tyranny, whatever you like the
Фактически Украина
best.
задачу выполнила.
And in fact, Ukraine
Я не
accomplished this
могу сказать
mission.
с минимальной помощью, но
I wouldn't
без
say it
военного
did it
прямого
with a
участия стран
minimal
НАТО.
help,
Да, конечно,
but
огромный
without a
объем военной
direct
помощи, хотя опять можно спорить,
involvement
на
of
самом
NATO
деле,
countries.
Он явно меньше того, который был бы необходим Украине для решительной
Of
победы.
course,
Но
it's
тем не менее,
less
вот
than
сегодня
Ukraine
Украина
could get for
может
its
считаться
decisive
просто
victory,
абсолютно
but
полноправным членом
nevertheless, we
НАТО,
can
в
say
отличие от
that
других
today
стран
Ukraine
НАТО.
is a
Оно
full member of
Украина
NATO
выполнила,
with its rights,
выполняет.
because
Я не
it
сильно
is
выполнит вот эту историческую
fulfilling
задачу.
this historical mission.
Поэтому, опять, я говорю, вот на все события, которые происходят в мире, надо смотреть через призму
So
именно
therefore, when I
этой
say
войны
we
и
need to look at all the events in the
постепенного
world through the
продвижения
lens of
украинских
this
войск
war,
к
and
своим государственным
we see
границам,
how
то есть границам
gradually Ukrainian
1991
troops are moving to its
года. И это
borders
и
of
это не только вопрос построения
1991.
украинских
And it's not only a matter of
границ,
restoring
это
Ukrainian
на самом
state
деле
borders.
приговор любым
It is actually a
агрессивным
sentence
войнам.
to
Потому
any
что
aggressive
победа
wars,
Украины — это не только восстановление
because
территориальной целостности,
Ukrainian victory, it's
это
not only
еще
restoration
и
of its territorial
кардинальное
integrity,
изменение
it is
мирового
also
геополитического раскладу.
critical
Я считаю, что эта
changes
победа фактически
in
гарантирует
the
в ближайшие
global
годы безопасность
political
Тайваня.
layout. For
Посмотрите
example, it can be a guarantee of the future of Taiwan. If we look at the other side of the map, if we move ourselves, 1,000 kilometers there, so we can see the situation there changed as well. Ukrainian victory, in some way, it's a guarantee of Taiwan's security
Вы уже
for
частично
the
об этом
next years.
сказали, да, затронули,
You partly
скажем так,
touched on
как
this,
мировое
Garry,
сообщество,
how
Запад коллективно,
the
я бы
global
сказал,
community
в
and
этом
the collective
ключе,
West,
встретили, отреагировали
how
на войну,
they
которую Путин развязал.
reacted
Но вот если
on the
бы
war
несколько
that Putin
углубиться в этот
waged.
вопрос и,
But
может
if
быть,
we
назвали
look
бы
deeper,
какие-то отдельные страны, отдельных политиков
and if
или
we try to
отдельные
name
организации, кто в
countries,
связи, опять же,
organizations,
с
or
контекстом войны в
politicians
Украине,
in the
приятно
context of this
удивил, а
war
тот, может
who
быть, сильно
positively
разочаровал.
surprised you or maybe disappointed you? Well, the list is quite long, and I don't know if we have a lot of time to talk about all of it. What to start with bad or good? Let's just start with the negative. In my view, I think Putin's invasion is a result of his strong conviction that the West is unable to resist Russian aggression. And it was based on the facts. It's not like he's living in a different reality. He's quite pragmatic in his view of the historical experience that he already had. After all, don't forget that Putin said very important words, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the largest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he said that not in 2000, but in 2005. But it was clear that in 2000, all these cranky ideas that he had in his head were determining his policy. And that's why one of his first actions when he became a president in 2000, he restored Soviet anthem. It's like Freudian idea. That was just a symbolic act. But between this act and his statement in 2005, there were 5 years. And what happened over these 5 years? He realized that he can dictate his will to the West. He completely destroyed independent media. There was a North-Ost terrorist attack, there was Beslan terrorist attack, there was a dissolution of Yukos company. Actually, he was already forming his dictatorship. And what was the West doing? The West doing nothing. It was still considering Putin as part of this international democratic community. In 2006, Putin was hosting G7 plus one summit in St. Petersburg. And even during Yeltsin time, Russia was never a full member of G7. Russia wasn't completely democratic and wasn't completely industrial country. Nevertheless, Putin was the host of this reception. There's this picture of Putin and the leaders of the free world. And I discussed this matter with Boris Nemtsov back then. And we didn't know what to do, because how can you say that Putin is not a democratic leader when you show people this picture? If an average Russian person who is sympathizing with us, opposition, and when he sees this picture of Merkel, George W. Bush and Putin, and then they might think to themselves, so what's going on? So all these leaders, they accept Putin. They think that he's one of them. So what about all those opposition leaders? Why they say that Russia took the wrong path and the election doesn't work in Russia and all that. But look, the West has a different idea about it. By 2022, Putin had enough information that convinced him that successful realization of his military plans in Ukraine is quite possible. And he wasn't the only one who didn't have doubt about it. CIA didn't have doubts, and Pentagon didn't have doubts. And actually they thought that Ukraine wouldn't be able to resist for a long time. It wouldn't be able to resist the second army in the world. Yet there were voices that were saying the situation is not that simple and Ukraine has the army and desire to fight. But politically in the West, nobody was listening to these voices. And the Western forecast wasn't any different from Putin's forecast. And that proves that Putin was relying on quite a logical construct that was built from these facts that he drew from analysis of different agencies. And we can say there is this general policy of the West, and there are people who are responsible for this. And of course, there are two people, key people, who are responsible for this audacious policy of Putin. This is Barack Obama and Angela Merkel, because they were leaders of the Western world when Putin moved from his plans to actions. Obama was in power from 2008 to 2016, and Merkel from 2005 to 2015, kind of infinitely. Obama doesn't even touch this subject. But actually, during Obama's term, all these things happened, including so-called reset, and actually it happened right after the events in Georgia, after the invasion of Georgia. And in 2012, they recorded words of Obama that he was passing to Putin through Medvedev. So tell Vladimir that I will be more flexible after the election. And during Obama, Putin realized that America is not ready for a resistance after Syria. And all that was happening against the backdrop of Merkel making Germany a hostage of Russian gas. Yes, of course, the gas was quite cheap and the economy was growing pretty fast, but actually Merkel transformed Germany into Russian gas hub. And that convinced Putin that everything is going according to the plan. And during Merkel's term, they managed to push the building of Nord Stream 2. And Germany was twisting people's arms to launch Nord Stream 2. And it was commissioned. Now look at it through Putin's eye. Don't say he's living in a different reality. Everything worked out. They gave up. And through Germany, Europe became a hostage of Russian gas. And Merkel was constantly lying, and he was saying that it's impossible to replace Russian gas. But we can see that for less than a year, Germany is refusing Russian gas, and this process is happening. And under absolutely, completely changed circumstances, under circumstances of the war. And clearly, the decisions must be made much quicker, and it costs threefold more. There were other projects, and Putin was constantly cutting them. There was a pipeline that was supposed to go through Georgia. He cut it. People don't remember that one of the reasons why Putin got involved in Syria, it was his plan to shut down the Qatar gas project. And one of the reasons why Qatar was supporting Syrian insurgents, these anti-Assad groups, Qatar needed this territory. There was Iraq, and Syrian territory could be this last link between Qatar and Europe. And a few years later, Gazprom would be out of business because Qatar has infinite reserves of gas. So Putin got involved there too. Putin was getting ready for this war in Ukraine. He never abandoned his goal to liquidate Ukraine, and he spoke about it quite openly. And Europe and America were just calmly observing all this. And of course, we need to add here another thing. That Biden administrations got this disgraceful the Iran nuclear deal that actually prolonged existence of bloody Iranian regime. And this was actually one of the reasons why Putin was so sure that America is not ready to get involved in the conflict, because one of the key advisors in this matter was John Kerry, who actually has quite a good relationship with Biden. They were in Senate for a long time, they're friends. Besides Bill Burns, director of CIA, former ambassador of the US in Russia, and the second man in the State Department during the Obama term. He also thought that they had to make so-called complex deals with Russia. And discussing this green energy, Iran and Ukraine was one of the points on this agenda. And they kind of, Biden managed to convince Putin that this issue of Ukraine could be kind of played around. And I think that created a backdrop against which Putin was sure he can do whatever he wants, that people will not do anything, and he didn't really consider others like serious rivalries. And France was covered with Russian propaganda, and if you look at the results of the first round of presidential elections in France during the war, it was April of this year, 55% of the French were voting for those candidates who were openly supporting Putin. And then Macron won. He wasn't openly supporting Putin, but that was quite an indicator. England, the UK had Brexit and couldn't sort of participate. The picture was like this. And of course, now positive. Ukraine will always remember Boris Johnson. Whatever they say about Boris Johnson in the UK as a prime minister, what he did, Brexit and so on. But his decision to come to Ukraine, to Kiev, and to help Ukraine, that will be in the history books. And I think it's important that among the Brits, Zelensky's heroism and his mission to resist the overwhelming forces of the aggressor reminded the Brits Sir Winston Churchill. That's why we can see here parallels between 1940 and 2022. I think it inspired Boris Johnson. Besides, he wrote books about Winston Churchill. I think these historical associations inspired him, and his visit to Kiev, that was a landmark. And of course, an incredible solidarity that Poland demonstrated. There were a lot of questions to Polish government, and oftentimes they compared them with the Hungarians. But in Hungary it's different. In Hungary we have Orban, who blocks all decisions of the European Union and supports Moscow. And on the other hand, we have this incredible help from Poland and Polish solidarity with Ukraine. And Putin couldn't really calculate that because he saw all these historical conflicts between Poland and Ukraine. But Morawiecki's government demonstrated that the Poles are ready to forget all those conflicts with Ukraine, and they remember who is the common historical enemy. Over the centuries, this genetic memory turned out to be stronger than anything else. Regarding the Baltic countries, for them this genetic memory, it's not centuries, this is just recent events. Many people remember what happened in 1991, and of course the solidarity of Baltic countries, Poland and the UK pushed the United States, because in the beginning the United States were not sure. Biden's administration was not ready that Ukrainians will be resisting, that the situation will go beyond the partisan war that all the deplorable analysts from CIA were predicting. And one of the arguments was why not to give Ukrainians the weapons when General Milley said at the beginning of February of 2022, they said that Ukraine wouldn't be able to resist for more than a week. That's why any modern weapons that were given to Ukraine will be taken over by the Russians. So that's why don't give the weapons to Ukraine. The war that is now in a different phase, it's a long-going war. And we see how a new political reality is shaped in Europe. All this made Americans move. Of course, Biden does less than needed for Ukrainians' victory, but much more than Putin expected. So we have to give credit to Biden. And with this, Europe is changing, Germany, France. Of course, in Germany, they still have this psychological block in people's mind, and that they shouldn't give weapons that will be used against Russians. I think there's an element of this kind of psychology that generations of Germans were raised with. Yet, I'd say that Ukraine suffered from Hitler's aggression probably even more than territory of the Russian Federation. Despite everything, the German weapons come to Ukraine, tanks will come, quite significant support comes to Ukraine, and Scholz supports Ukraine. Despite all the critique that we hear, he actually changed German policy that was formed since 1969. Back then he was a young social democrat, and his Willy Brandt and Schmidt were his role models. They were building this Eastern policy, and then Christian Democrats they continued this. For over 50 years, this policy was constant, and now it is changed. So now Germany is with Ukraine. And of course, they are trying to find, if not compromises, but they're trying to find opportunities to avoid the inevitable. And this is the problem of Americans and Germans. They understand that the victory of Ukraine, this will be the end of the Russian Empire. So going back to the 30th of December of 2022, it's 100 years of the Soviet Union. And of course, the age of this formation is much longer, because the USSR was the successor of the Russian Empire, and this war actually finalizes the history of this empire that is not among the living. Many peoples that live in Russia and neighboring Russia, they have, mildly speaking, quite a critical attitude to the history they had with Russia. That's why it's good that we're talking about this day, the 30th of December, the foundation of Soviet Union. We need to remember that this history should remain history, because the dead cannot drag the living with them. From the very beginning, the Free Russia Forum and all the conferences that we held, we keep saying that this war should be the last war of the Russian Empire. No matter how you call this formation, Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, it should be the last war. And a couple of remarks from me on what you just said. It's worth remembering this statement of Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General. No matter how paradoxically it may sound, the road to peace goes through shipments of weapons to Ukraine. And of course, if we speak about the Baltic countries, then we should remember January 13th, 1991, those events in Vilnius when the Soviet Empire was collapsing. You spoke about Free Russia Forum, and I think it is a good time to sum it up for the forum. So what happened in 2022, and I think that this non-compromising position that the forum stood for turned out to be right and adequate evaluation of what Putin is about. What kind of year was it for the forum, and what you're planning to have in 2023? I would like to believe that some liberals will join this point of view, as you said. In fact, the majority of the Russian people who position themselves as liberals, they consider the forum as the continuation of those anti-Putin resistance traditions that started in 2005 when a United Civil Front was created. And this forum continued our cause in immigration. From the beginning of the forum, we were attacked not by the Kremlin propaganda only, but those who were our colleagues in the democratic camp. And they blamed us because in the beginning we were saying that Putin's regime will inevitably transform into fascism. And they kept saying that we are radicals and that we impede the evolutionary process of the regime. And then Medvedev came around with freedom and non-freedom saying, and some of the Russian liberals, they joined so-called Medvedev's majority. And over all this time, up to 24th of February 2022, they continued living in this political space that was shrinking. And nevertheless, they kept saying that there is a hybrid democracy, that we need to find opportunities to work within this regime. And what do you want? What do you want from us? Do nothing? Then it's going to be worse. And we keep arguing about it. For example, representatives of Navalny groups, they tell us, we had to do nothing. Well, actually, our answer is to them, yes, it's better to do nothing. because everything that was happening in Russia back then was creating this backdrop against which Putin was preparing his aggressive war against Ukraine. Many times we spoke with Nemtsov about this, and we encountered this reaction in Berlin and Brussels, in Washington, when they were saying, why sanctions? Look, there is opposition in Russia. There are municipal elections, and actually your sanctions proposals are not supported by a majority of your colleagues. And I can remind you everything, and we can see this whole list of these people who were against that. Sanctions shouldn't be introduced, or should be selective sanctions. Sanctions are wrong. And they were saying there are so many opportunities to work within Russia. We were already in immigration, and people were prosecuted in Russia. But life was kind of going on. Many words were said, beginning in 2008 and 2009, and when we still could talk on the radio echo of Moscow, when it was still functioning. And they were saying, maybe it's not democracy, maybe it's not sovereign democracy, but it's hybrid democracy. But if you're too radical, it's going to be bad. I remember when I wrote an open letter to the foreign minister of Germany, and he didn't respond directly to me, but it was indirect answer. And he said, what are you asking for? You're asking us not to let Russia in the European Council. And he said that many organizations that work in Russia, they say that Russia should be represented in the Council of Europe. So all these activities created this backdrop against which our warnings were neglected when we were saying that Putin is war. People were saying that we're taking too radical of a position. And those liberals and other publications, they had a different position. TV Rain channel and Medusa publication, they did not report about the activities of the Free Russia Forum. They considered it to be working on the fringe. But it was the most influential venue where many people came to and participated in. But these so-called liberal media, they considered us an impediment for them to function within the Putin regime. From the beginning of Putin's aggression, we were supporting territorial integrity of Ukraine. We said that it's impossible to support annexation of Crimea, and everybody who was living within Putin regime, they had to support annexation of Crimea, and everybody knows how it was going on. They made a lot of concessions, these people, to continue their operations in Russia, and we used to say that these activities were as minimum meaningless, but actually now we know they were harmful, because nobody was doing anything on the West, seeing that there is an opposition there. Many of these organizations were working using the grants from the West. Under these conditions, today's conditions, when our political position is actually a dominating discourse, we still think that it's very important to indicate that the main goal of Russian opposition to Putin's regime, this is the victory of Ukraine, unconditional victory. And with this, everybody should be tested. Those who express their disagreement with Putin's regime. Because, while we're talking, there are lots of crimes committed in Ukraine. And this test is very simple. First, it's a total liberation of territory of Ukraine, including Crimea and Sevastopol city. It's not like, don't blur it. This should be stated clearly. And secondly, compensating Ukraine for the damage that Russia did to Ukraine. It's like hundreds of billions of dollars. And thirdly, that I think is the final accord, so to speak. This is to bring all the criminals, war criminals, to trial. They should they should be prosecuted. And of course, this list could be longer, and I can talk quite long about it. And recently we published two documents of the Russian Committee of Action regarding the war and how Russia should be arranged. But we need to admit that all these documents and all this ideological base, this is many years' work of the forum, and even today, as I said, the ideological base of the forum becomes a dominating discourse. We still have quite a number of active political activists among the Russian immigrants who are trying to find a way to coexist with their old discourse. And this story with the TV Rain channel in Latvia is quite indicative. We need to understand that we don't have a voting right in this issue. We cannot criticize the Baltic countries and Ukraine and Poland, being Russian citizens. We don't have the right to criticize. We are representatives of the country that are committing war crimes, outrageous war crimes, unseen in Europe since World War II. People in Ukraine, Poland, and Baltic countries, they may say that Stalin's crimes were quite similar to Nazis' crimes, and they're right. We just need to understand that all these talks about this great Russian culture that's separate from Putin and this historical memory and all that, we just need to shut up. We don't have the right to talk about it. Maybe later we'll have this right, maybe 5 years later or maybe 10 years later. That'd be great. But right now we don't have this right. They keep trying to distance themselves, saying that this is Putin's war. No, it is Russia's war. And you, by the way, played quite a role in this war, because you were impeding the West to see the inevitability of Russian fascism that was growing during Putin's term over all these years. Pictures of ruined Grozny, Aleppo or Mariupol, they are the same. Crimes of Putin's regime are rooted in 1990s. These gangsters, St. Petersburg. All this is an outcome of unfinished reforms in Russia that brought in power this mix of KGB and mafia. And of course the forum continues its work, and our historical rightness is proved today. And I think that any reasonable person from the Russian opposition who wants Russia to be back on the civilized track, who considers themselves a patriot of Russia, you need to do everything to help Ukraine to win. The sooner Ukraine wins, the sooner it restores its territorial integrity, the more chances we have to free ourselves from Putin's fascism. And Garry, as I know that you are planning to expand geographically with the forum. Yes, of course. We are planning to go beyond Vilnius, Lithuania, and these conferences should be held not only in Vilnius, in Riga and Tallinn, it should be held in other European cities. Now, it is very important to demonstrate our solidarity with Ukraine. For this, we include the third language in our documents of the forum. The main language is Russian and English, and we will translate the documents into Ukrainian language. It should be one of the official languages of today's forum. This is also the demonstration of our solidarity with Ukraine, so we have quite a plan to expand the work of the forum. After the 24th of February 2022, we became a flagship of this process. So far, we are uniting a smaller part of the Russian opposition that is in immigration, but nevertheless, our historical rightness, this is the guarantee that we will be moving forward. We'll create a new institute that will be run by Alexander Morozov, who will be accumulating all these issues and processing them. And please take a look at the documents of the forum. that will be soon posted, and in 2023 we will be moving forward, because I am absolutely sure that 2023 will be the year of Ukrainian victory, and it will be the year when we will start liberating Russia from Putin's fascism. And I, in turn, ask our audience to subscribe to our social networks and click the bell and click subscribe. And probably at the end, I would like to hear some therapeutical words from you, because you said positively that 2023 will be the year of Ukrainian victory. Gary, what events or, say, news give you this hope for this victory? What warmed my heart recently, I got this news about Lithuania. We are based in Vilnius, and I read all the news here. For 1 year and a half, for the first time in Lithuanian stock exchange, they showed a negative price for electricity. And what I think, which means that Russian energy blackmail is not going to work. So that gave me hope. So do you have anything similar to that? Recalling my experience from my previous life, so to speak, from chess, it's not really a rule, but a practical understanding, I'd say. What's important, not the result, but the trend. I remember when I was playing the second match with Karpov in 1985 for the champion title. I won the first game, then I lost the second game, then I lost the fifth and the fourth game, and I was in negative, so to speak. And for Karpov, it was enough to have draws to keep the title. And then there was quite a struggle between us. And then one of my assistants from Hungary told me that what's important, this is the trend. So, and this movement towards the right direction, then I was able to fight back. And in game 11, Karpov overlooked a combination, and I managed to win the match. So trend, this is what's important. And the trend shows us today that Ukraine will win. Putinism will collapse. And this Russian Empire or USSR, whatever you call it, will collapse. And the Western world is changing, maybe has changed already. The world is transiting to a new qualitative state. Always wars triggered this process, and this process is happening. And it cost a lot. Ukrainian blood. But nevertheless, the trend gives us all grounds to be optimistic. 2023 can be a year of a new era, not only for Ukraine and not only for Russia, but for the whole world. Yes, right. Thank you very much. I see there were a lot of New Year greetings in our chat, and we say Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you very much, Garry. Thank you. Happy New Year. We were talking about the outcomes of the year together with Garry Kasparov, and we're trying to see what's going to happen in 2023. We did it together with Garry Kasparov, co-founder of Free Russia Forum and the 13th World Chess Champion and politician. So Happy New Year, warmth and light to all of you in all ways, to Ukraine and Ukrainians. Thank you very much.